Hello and welcome to episode 37 of the DX Mentor, Improving Your DX Experience, Part 1. Thank you for joining us. I'm Bill, AJB. If this is the first time you're joining us, welcome. We have a back catalog of over 30 episodes covering many aspects of DX in both podcast and YouTube format. Please check us out. If you're new to DXing, I would really recommend episode 1 as it was recorded with several world-class DXers. You will get a feel of the excitement that goes with chasing DX. Remember, if you like what you find, please subscribe, like, and share. If you have questions or comments, please email me directly at thedxmentor@gmail.com. Well, speaking of email, I received an email from Brian, VE3GMZ. He wrote, quote, I have a question about awards. It seems like the ARRL is the official award grantor, but CuraZ offers similar awards when CUSOs are confirmed on the online logging system they have engineered. It's very simple. The logging program matches CUSOs from submitted posts when 2 logs confirm a contact is made. It counts to one of their proprietary awards. Does the ARRL accept these confirmations towards their awards? And if not, why not? LOTW is not the only game in town. There is an EQSL, and I'm sure there are others. Well, Brian, the ARRL is the de facto standard when it comes to DX awards. The main reason is that they started the DXCC program and it quickly grew faster than all the others. Now, before a DXpedition can take place, they work with the ARRL to get groups certified, quote, so that it counts towards the DXCC award. There is a fairly rigorous set of guidelines and requirements that must be met before the DXpedition can count for DXCC credit. All of the other ones you mentioned don't require their own certification, but follow the lead of the ARRL. And there have been DXpeditions that did not qualify for DXCC. So it's a great question, but unfortunately, if that's what you're interested in, you're locked into the ARRL. And by the way, you don't have to be an ARRL member to use Logbook of the World. You can upload to it to at least make your CUSOs available to everyone else. So just like Brian did, if you have a question, just email me, thedxmentor@gmail.com. So our guest today is Ralph Bellis, K9ZO. Here's a bit of a bio on Ralph. Quote, my interests include technology, entrepreneurship, contesting, DXing, CW, VHF, propagation, and being very active on the HF bands. DXpeditions really excite me. I'm an assistant director of the ARRL, 50-year member, and a life member with the ARRL. I'm a past president, state coordinator, and former board member of the Society of Midwest Contesters, W9SMC. I am the former, quote, contesting on a budget column editor for the National Contest Journal. I'm a former member of the Metro DX Club. I have earned 10-band DXCC, 10-band WAS, and the Triple Play Award. I am active with DXCC Challenge with 2,911 slots. For DXCC Honor Roll, I have 358 mixed, 353 CW, 358 phone, 319 digital countries. I've earned 5-band WAZ. I've been fortunate enough to have been part of DX teams which were awarded the DXpedition of the Year award. So also joining us will be Joe, WAGEX, an accomplished DXer in his own right, and he'll, as always, have great input. So without any further delay, let's get started. Well, good evening and welcome to the latest edition of the DX Mentor program. Tonight's entitled Improving Your DX Experience. And I'll tell you, Joe and I are really, really excited. We have one of Joe's DXpedition mates with us tonight. Hopefully he'll share a few stories and debunk a few other ones that Joe has kind of passed on to us, but we'll deal with that later. But I'll start with Joe, WAGEX. A quick introduction, please.
Well, thanks, and it's really a pleasure to be here tonight with my dear friend Ralph. We've been on a couple big major DXpeditions, and first time I've seen him in a while. We've talked and exchanged emails, but first time we really had a look at one another. But I've been around, as everybody, our regular listeners know, for 53 years. Love DXing. And because of DXing is what brought Ralph and I together a couple times, and here we are again tonight. So looking forward to it, Bill.
Great, wonderful. And our special guest tonight is Ralph, K9ZO. So Ralph, would you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us how you got into this crazy hobby?
Hi, I'm Ralph Bellis, K9ZO. I've been licensed since '69, and I got licensed because our school shop teacher was a ham, and he got a handful of us interested. And, we would talk about who we were working at and talking to each other on the radio. And then we realized he was spying on us. And so we would always try to increase our code speed to see if he could still copy, and we couldn't copy that fast, but we could send that fast. And that's what got me going. And I graduated from high school early. My dad moved to London. And so when I was 17, I started operating over in England and fell in with some guys from the RSGB. And here it's over 50 years later, and some of those guys are still active. And it's fun to follow them because they'll do little things like a VHF field day, and I'll catch wind of it and I'll email them and say, what roads are you taking? And what pub are you going to stop at for lunch? Because then I can go online and look at the menu and see what they're doing. And then they'll send me a couple pictures when they get to their campsite. So it's really fun to follow those guys. And then, some of them are still going on occasional vacation type expeditions. But that's really where I first got started in DXing, is to be able to go around with some portable operations in Scotland and England and Wales. And then we took some time and went over to Belgium, and I got to operate from over there. So when I came back to the US, I worked around in two-way radios. Motorola was a thing. We didn't have cell phones quite then, but we installed radios in anything that moved. So I got to learn about doing tower work and how radios worked, and eventually built up a station at my parents' house. And then eventually I went to college, got married. And at one time, we had a 70-foot tower, and all three guy wires were in neighbors' yards. I mean, those were the days when you would just ask neighbors if it was okay to put an anchor in the backyard behind their garage, and it was fine. So managed to get on, and I've pretty much been able to be on the air all the time. And I think that makes a big difference when you're DXing, because as I look back at some of the countries, the most wanted list, even the top 20 or 30, they're not active, or they're really hard. And they used to be, you could catch them, maybe one year or something, but the whole bunch of those countries are not active. And that's one of the big differences, I think, when guys are trying to move their totals way up there in the high 200s, is it takes a long time, and the world situation is really different. When we were starting, Joe, you would find stations on the US embassies spread over Africa, and that's how they communicated back and forth. And so we could find guys all over Africa. And now you can say on any given day, there's probably 5 countries in Africa that are active. And it makes it pretty hard to catch some of those places. The political situations have changed. So I was lucky that over a long period of time, I've been able to be on the air and have a reasonable station. Eventually we got our own house, and it was on the edge of town. But as I look back, it was really noisy. The infrastructure from the power company was built in the 1940s, but I had 3 towers up, and plenty of antennas and a radio room in the basement. And then I retired in 2016, and we moved to this rural location. And I'm still building the station, but it's one of those extremely quiet. I can turn the volume all the way up at the radio, and it's perfectly quiet. And I've had a really time during the sunspot lows on the low bands, and 10 meters now is really good. But I've got so many projects with the station on right now. It's continuous. It keeps me, every day I make some progress, even if it's doing a little bit of soldering or something of that sort. I'm making progress on building up the station. So that's kind of the long-term history, that I've been lucky to be able to be active pretty much the whole time.
I went over your QRZ.com webpage, and I would encourage everybody to check out K9ZO. The one thing that jumped out at me was your photography. It is phenomenal. Well done.
Well, I have a lot more, and I don't know what to do with it, because that's been keeping me, yesterday, I think after supper, 7 o'clock till 2 in the morning, I'm in editing photos and figuring out, well, what are the good ones of the kids to keep and, get rid of duplicates and making those decisions. And then I noticed there's a lot of what, for example, I was telling Joe that I ran into the Wake Island pictures. There's a lot of good ones in there. So
Yeah.
I'm continually finding stuff I didn't know that I had around. And, it takes a lot of work, but I really like the guys that put the effort into their QRZ pages because you learn a lot from what they're doing. It gives you something to, write to them about to see what they're doing, and a lot of good technical information that way.
Yeah. So the other thing that jumped out, I'm really curious do you work contests so that your wife can cook, or does she cook to help you in the contest? Because some of the pictures I thought I was looking at Bobby Flay's page or something.
Well, her hobby is sort of nutritious cooking. So I don't care how much paper she uses, because she'll find recipes and print them all, try them. And, every night we're trying kind of something different. And then we've already planned, well, here's some stuff for September when we have some guys over, and figuring out the menu. So I think that's important, that you involve your spouse in radio stuff. I mean, she rarely comes to the shack. I mean, maybe once a month, but my shack is in a separate building from the house. So, there's no reason I could just stay here all the time. I'm pretty lucky. But, I think that's important, that you do things with your wife that don't have anything with radio. So we do a lot of sports and football games and baseball games and soccer with the grandkids, who are, everybody's under teenagers right now. So we're really involved with that. And that's the thing that she really likes to do. So
Well, good. So one of the projects I've always wanted to mess around with here, I've got about 2 acres overall, and you have a 40-meter Foursquare. And I think, based on what I saw on the webpage at the time, it wasn't completed yet. So I'm curious if it's completed and what the results were. And actually, I'd love to have not tonight, but another conversation with you on the 40-meter Foursquare.
Okay. Well, I can talk more about the 80-meter one because it's finished.
Okay.
And it was literally 2 summers ago, spending most of the summer lying on my stomach with the generator soldering stuff, and then trying to keep the weeds down and finish that thing, because I think there's about 4 miles of wire in that thing. And I was pretty lucky that there was an area that I sort of claimed that was about 900 feet away. And that's where the Foursquare is. It's away from the house. And I took a little bit of a field that we have farmed. And the thing that I noticed that strikes me, people always say you put down radials and the grass will grow over them. Nah, that doesn't really happen. Your lawnmower will just suck those radials up and chew them up. So earlier this spring, I went out and did maintenance on stuff that was picked up. And then, we do use a lot of pesticides and fertilizers and herbicides in the fields out here. And if I go out to my fields and get some dirt, nothing will grow in that dirt a couple of years, which is good because I can spread that in places like around the bottom of the verticals, and then you don't get any weeds growing. But it doesn't really cover up, and you can't plant grass and expect grass to grow in that.
We did a show with Scott Wright, K0MD, and his Foursquare 80-meter array. And what struck me about that was he had hundreds and hundreds of hours of smaller things, like getting all the radial. I say smaller, I mean relative to putting 4 large verticals up, but just the trenches that he had to dig to get the cable out, and the control cables and the phasing things, and get the wire under the grass so that it wouldn't get you. I was just hundreds and hundreds of hours. So it's an amazing project. I think that's what jumped out at me.
And I think we might have the same BA2 by DX Engineering.
Yep.
And I'm out here where it's flat in the country and the wind just howls. A lot of times the wind just howls. And I worked with them to re-engineer that to make it a bit sturdier, because the top piece is a 1/4-inch tubing and it actually bends in the wind. It gets that strong out here.
Wow.
So we have redone that, and actually 2 weeks ago I sent him some more ideas, because even though there were a couple hose clamps on the pieces, they pulled apart.
Wow.
Really?
And I'll use set screws or something of that sort, or some sheet metal screws, and redo that, because what I was hearing was a little bit of crackling, and crackling to me means there's mechanical movement, there's noise. And so I went out and did some repairs, a couple extra clamps. But the thing I like working with those guys is they seem to recognize if you have perfect products, it kind of lowers your cost and you're a better business that way, because you don't have to do all the support stuff. And guys like, cause it's just like Mosley antennas. They're just big and sturdy, and they'll last for years and years and years, or should I say decades.
Yeah.
So that was a big project. I'm glad I undertook it, because on my one of my newer screens, I'll show I was on ADFT. The entire screen was red of JAs calling me. And I'm thinking, well, geez, this thing works. And during the sunspot lows, I could go on 2 hours before our sunset, start working Europeans,
Yeah.
and just work them all through the night. And then about an hour before the Japanese sunrise or sunset, I could catch those guys on and work them for about 4 hours, and it would be light out here a good hour or so after the sun up, and I'm still running JAs.
Wow.
So it's a good killer antenna. My control box is 4 directions only, but last fall I ran new control cables so I can do omnidirectional, because for contests here in the Midwest, I'm finding that you have to ask for a call again because you were pointed in the wrong direction. So I think an omnidirectional for us in the Midwest is really the way to go. Now the 40-meter Foursquare, this is like my kind of cheap project, because I scrounged in the dumpster at my son's landscaping company, because I needed some like 4x6s to mount the poles to, and then the 1.5-inch pieces of tubing. They used to be like part of an H-frame for a 2-meter EME array. And there's pieces of 10 meters, 15, 20 meters, and 2-meter antennas to make my roughly 32 feet of tubing for that. And then I just used some metal strapping with a bunch of stainless steel bolts to hook all of the radials on. So it's a big project. I'm right now waiting. The weather is like kind of spitting rain and cold, and it's starting to warm up every once in a while, but I've got about 250 radials cut and spread out. So the next thing is trench those in and start soldering all the stuff together. The control cables are run. There's a control box out there. And so all that part is really done. So the 40-meter one is coming along pretty well. And I think it's going to be good because it'll be reliable and flexible. And it's so quick to be able to turn from east to west. And it's kind of the omnidirectional also.
So when you get that done, maybe we'll have a 40 and 80-meter Foursquare, because they're both their own big projects. And I think that would really, really be interesting. So the other thing that jumped out is a multi-talented ham you are, is your WRTC experience. How was that?
I love that thing, because you get to meet all these guys that you talk to or you contact in the contests. And I went as a competitor, and it's really interesting when you get to that level, then you realize how little you know about it, and also how these factors, like Joe, that we would run across things in an expedition that didn't work, or we didn't have things that we needed, and you could figure it's hard to do in a contest in WRTC, because there's 2 of you and the clock is ticking, but you figure things that didn't do right, or maybe you have an equipment failure, and what are you supposed to do? You lose if you have a high noise location. So it's pretty hard to be a competitor. And when I went, that was before they knew a whole lot about sort of the location analysis. So some places were really good, some weren't. I can remember in Slovenia, you'd get on and you'd hear these other competitors and they'd be running Europeans and the US, and you say, well, I can't hear any of these. Our particular location was on the top of maybe 1,000-foot hill, and there was a megawatt broadcast station there.
Oh,
And it would have been great for VHF and a nice low angle, but you missed all of Europe that way. It was interesting too to be a referee and see these top guys and the way that they would operate and work together and the hand signals. And so I got to see them from both angles, and you see the hospitality and the just the vast amount of work that it takes to put something like this together.
that's terrific. Well, what we're here for is to kind of go over your presentation, let's say, improving your DX experience. So I'm going to share my screen, but we want to do it in such a way where the podcast folks aren't left out. I think we shouldn't have any trouble doing that. So hopefully you can see that.
I've got the audience one.
Yeah, so that's where we want to start. So, you know, the entire podcast / YouTube channel is really targeted for entry-level DXers, I would say up to about 250 countries now. And we want input from people above that, and everyone's learning, and that's been terrific. But again, I go back to the comments and emails I get, and it's typically there's several guys that have now made 100, so they would send me an email. Hey, just like you guys said, you know, once I got my butt in the chair and really stayed focused, I was able to do this. So I kind of have an idea what the audience is. So if you want to go ahead and pick it up, Ralph, and Joe and I will just interrupt you as we need to.
All right, sure. So that's good, because this is what I was thinking, and it was, you know, DXers that are, you got about 100 countries, you know, you kind of have caught on, you're interested in it, you know, and you're working your way up to 250. Things change quite a bit when you get to saying, the ones I need are really far away, or they're only on every couple of years. That's a different strategy to them. You have to know about it, because if you're a beginner, you don't want to miss the good stuff and say, I'll get it later, because some of this stuff doesn't show a decade later. So you have to keep your eye on the rare stuff. But if you're working for 200 or 250, there's a different strategy than saying, okay, I need the South Americans, the Caribbeans, and the Europeans, and I can work DXCC that way. Now we got to start looking at, here's the ones that are 100 guys that are active, and you got to start figuring out, when do they go to work? When do they sleep? What are just some of their operating habits? So that's the way you start looking at it, is here's some semi-uncommon places. And then the audience too, I mean, a lot of what I'll be talking about is, it doesn't have to be just a US guy. If you're in Europe, you're going to work the European guys that are close. You're going to have a pretty good shot at some of what we would consider the uncommon Middle East, an A6, an A7. Even to me, like, you know, Israel is pretty uncommon. Jordan is pretty uncommon. So you've got some of those that are uncommon, but not too hard to get because they're closer to you. So you really need to learn. I guess if you got this passion for DX and you say, there's a lot to this DXing, and it's really kind of fascinating, because a lot of times I just don't sit by the radio, but I'm on Wikipedia a lot, learning about the countries and trying to improve it. And some of my interest goes back even before we had internet, when I was going to college, and in some of the like international classes, we would talk about, hey, there's a bauxite mine in Jamaica where they mine aluminum ore, and then they have to ship it to New Zealand, because in New Zealand the electricity is cheaper and they can refine it there and then send it on. And we'd hear that, and it's like, well, we didn't have internet, but I could talk to hams in these countries and ask them about it. Or we had Mitsubishi Auto Factory in my town years ago, and well, there was a similar thing in Sweden where they said, oh, well, you know, the workers get to participate in the management process. And then you put somebody over in Sweden and they say, it's not really like that. You know, managers are the managers, the worker bees are the worker bees. So part of my interest is in geography and learning about the countries. So there's a big advantage to just getting on and rag chewing with the guys, and not just always getting on F8 for a quick QSO. So once you start learning about the foreign countries, and where they are, you say, oh, geez, here's farther ones. How do I get the farther ones? They don't come through as often. And then in your mind, you have to start following, well, here's sunrise and sunset in different parts of the world and how that changes. And the magic times are plus or minus an hour of sunrise, plus or minus an hour of sunset, both in my area and the DX end. So the ideal thing is, you can be far away, but we got this little window of kind of common twilight or just as day breaks. And that's a good time to be chasing for some of the distant stuff. Now they're in the sunspot highs, some of the rules change. It's a lot easier. We can get places like India at lunchtime. And then you think, wait a minute, that's almost midnight.
Yeah.
And that's where I use Alexa. I ask Alexa, what time is it in Tokyo? And Alexa will tell me, and I'll say, yeah, it's like 10 in the morning at work. So I'll go off and go outside and do something else. I also want to say that, you got to have some kind of budget, but you got your family, your job, your station. So I'm appealing more to the guys they're worker guys. And it's like, well, I didn't get this big inheritance and I'm not putting $1 million in my station, but what can I do to, improve it? And I would say the first thing you got to aim for is like a 50-foot tower and a tri-band. If you think you're going to get 250 countries with a vertical and 100 watts, you can do it. It's just going to take you a little while. So you kind of have to have this goal that's realistic, but maybe a little bit beyond your reach that you got to work towards. So let's go on to the next one. And so here's a bit about what I had done. I was lucky to be able to be on the as DX when I was 17. I was interested in geography and radio and business and a lot of different things that are really me part of radio. Always trying to improve things. I'm always fixing things. That's kind of the goal. And I went on some expeditions fairly early, and that helps. And I got involved in some contest, field day type of things. I chase DX all the time. I'm looking around, and you got to kind of come up with some goals for yourself to say, okay, I've got DXCC, but there's a 5-band DXCC. And if I don't get on 40 meters, I'm missing out on some things. And maybe some countries will show up on 40 that won't be elsewhere. Now that the sunspots are good, you really want to get on 10 and 12 meters and try to, expand your horizons from what your normal habits are. It's fun to rag chew with DX and talk to these guys. And I've been lucky to meet some of the guys. Right now, I'm focused on DXCC Challenge, because that's a real challenge, once you look at banned countries. And then when you get up there to a certain number, all of a sudden you realize, well, there's only like 10 or 15 banned countries out there that have guys that are active, and they don't show up on some of the bands. I really have to spend some time, and I'm almost at the point of saying, I need some of these rare DXpeditions that haven't been on for a while, so I can try to come on 160 and 80 and 40, or when we didn't have sunspots, to try to catch them on 10 meters. So I think you need to look at some of your other goals. Maybe you're saying, I want to do DXCC on sideband, and I want to do it on CW and do kind of separate things. So I'm saying, don't limit yourself right now, because later on you'll say, oh man, I missed that country and they were on an expedition and they're on CW and I didn't try back then. So try to kind of expand the things that you're interested in. Likewise, you can work on zones so far this year. Every zone has been active. So once you say, there's some faraway zones that are pretty rare and they're uncommon. The Russians 17, 18, 19, Siberia, that area, or some of the African ones, zone 34 is pretty uncommon. I try to track that guy down. I'll get a new country, but I'm also getting that zone. So, don't forget some of these other things that will force you to say, well, what are the countries in those zones? And when are they active? When do I have a chance of getting them? And I think that'll help direct you a little bit, and it increases your country total at the same time. Okay. So one thing that did is I realized that you have to have a good way of finding out when DX activity is. So of course, I would think by now everybody's using DXC Summit, and you can use that to find out when particular countries are active or particular areas. You could search for a prefix and see when those are active. So you need a way to get some information about the DX activity. And it could be other local guys that are trying to do things that'll, hey, get you on the phone and remind you, or say, hey, I subscribe to a DX bulletin. I'm hearing about the DXpedition or DX news. So that's an important thing. The other thing to do is you look at the DXCC country list or the club log most wanted list, and you compare it against the ones you've worked. And you try to sort out, well, what's the next targets going to be that I should have? Those top 10, they're going to be hard, and they're not active, and there's no expeditions, and there might be some things brewing. But let's look at that air that's the 120 countries, the 150, and say, something like Nicaragua is uncommon. There's just a couple stations on, active now. We know a little bit about their habits. They may not get on during like WPX contest, but they're there during the week. So you do a search on DX Summit for YN, and you say, okay, well, I need that one. And here's kind of the pattern and the bands of where these guys show up, and compare that list of, here's what I have, here's what's probably active. Don't forget about the rare ones. You want to get them, but they're not on the air right now. And the idea is to figure out, well, what's it going to take to do it? And if you're at the 100 watts in a vertical, then you got to really consider, I need to get some gain, or I just need to say, I heard that you could put down 4 radials and get your vertical to work. And, one of the antennas, and one of the first things I put up here is we had some big trees, 65-foot trees, and shot a wire up one of those and made a 80-meter vertical, 65 feet, pretty much in the clear. As you look out the front door here, I can just see to the horizon. I did the what you're supposed to do in theory. I put down 4 radials, and it was nice and broadband. It covered from 3.5 to 3.8, and nobody could hear me. With 4 radials, there's a lot of absorption. So I said, okay, well, next thing to do is I'll put down 16 radials. I just added more radials, and then I got some chicken wire, and I laid out chicken wire, and then pretty soon people could say, yeah, we can hear you okay. And then I added more radials till I got like 40 radials out there. That was a big job, but they were on the grass. It's always hard around here for me to cut the grass because there's stuff laying all over the place. But then guys would say, you're really loud. And then that got me thinking, well, I should do a 4-square, because then it'd be magnificent. And it really is. So figure out what it's going to take. I mean, if your place is noisy, then you're going to have to say, I need some kind of loop antenna. I need a beverage on the ground, and figure out what your weakness is. And if you're running 100 watt amplifiers, they're not cheap, but you can get SV220s and, any kind of amp to get you around 500 watts. That's going to make a big difference. The other thing is improve your skills. Get on CW and learn to recognize your code. I do the CWTs 3 times a week, and I've done hundreds of them now, just to keep my skill up, because you have to be able to, in a pileup, recognize your call or part of your call that he's coming back to you, or figure out, here's his call, or here's who he's trying to work, and I'm tuning my dials to try to hear through the pileup to who he's working. So always try to be improving your skills.
Yeah, I thought I heard you in the CWT today, actually.
Yes.
Yeah, earlier today. Would you both agree that if I've got 100 watts and I've got a vertical right now, let's say, am I better off buying an amplifier, or better off improving my antenna?
Amplifiers easier, and if you could do it, and you come upon an amp that's like, hey, here's an amp, and I can use it, I would definitely do that. I mean, with me, it was hard at this shack because this building was designed to be a pool, a room for, like, they were going to put a swimming pool out here, and you don't put a swimming pool 3 feet from a plowed cornfield. I'm not sure what they were thinking, so they never did the pool. But the building is here and pretty much perfect radio. So I have a room with the radios and then a 2-car garage, which is like a hardware store. And but I had to do the structure, like, okay, well, we need 4 outlets, separate circuit breakers. They got to be for amplifiers, and then every outlet in this building on the same circuit breaker. So we need to have 4 more 110-volt circuit breakers brought in, and they should come down from the ceiling and that kind of stuff. So if it's easy for you to add an amp, then go do that. But your long-term goal should be, all right, I really want that 40 or 50-foot tower. Maybe you can't do 50 feet, that's okay. 40 feet, house bracketed, and a tri-bander, then you've made a huge improvement of vertical. But you can, I'm sure, get to 200 countries with a vertical. It's just going to take you a while. You're going to miss some stuff. Or you'd say, I spent a long time, like 4 hours trying to get that guy, and you could have got him and gone off and done something else with your family, or fixed the car, or whatever else you had to do. So you have to kind of balance what you're doing and how long it's going to take. So here's an analysis that I did about 2 years ago. I looked at the countries that I had, and I said, okay, well, what bands am I kind of weak on? And there's 160 meters, 124. And I thought, well, geez, how am I ever going to get to like 3,000 band countries? So I started constructing. I've got a 103-foot Titanics pipe, and it's mounted in the ground, and there's 21 radials so far. I have to do some work with the hardware and the guying and get some guys to do some like screw-in anchors for it. But the 160 thing is pretty much taken care of. I put up beverages, and that's hard. And I'll put the SAL 30 back up again, but I know how to improve that so that it won't come down, because 50-mile-an-hour winds like nothing. That always happens around here. So I have to beef things up a little bit. The 80-meter one, I put in the 4-square, and that's just a question of if the guys are on or they're on a DXpedition, they just have to be there, and I'll be able to get them. Likewise, I didn't have a whole lot of countries on 12 meters because in the past, when I didn't have a 12-meter antenna, I would just flip around to my different antennas, and if they were louder on the 80-meter antenna, I'd use the 80-meter antenna. So I missed that way. And then likewise, 6 meters. Right now I'm up at 114 countries on 6 meters. And that just took a time waiting for those couple days when there were openings and making sure that I was ready. And then, we started to have FT8, and there's a lot more activity, but 6 meters is pretty hard. You need guys that are going to call you and say, 6 meters is open, because I'm not the kind of guy that's going to sit with my radio all day. I got stuff outside to do. I'm always working on projects. So somebody has to tell me that 6 meters is open, or I wouldn't know. So I looked, and then on 6 meters, I've got a couple more Yagis on the ground, and I got a bunch of towers. So it really means putting up like a 40 or 50-foot tower, a pretty low 6-meter antenna to improve that. But that's the kind of analysis that you might want to do. This is for DXE challenge, but you might do the same thing and say, okay, well, let me group my 100 countries by, do I have African countries, South American, Caribbean, and say, well, what do I really need to work that's active? Because some stuff is hard. I mean, Bolivia, there's only a couple folks. Europe, there's only a couple folks that are on. And if you need those two, that has to be part of your strategy to say, well, when do they come in? And, you have to realize that those guys are in the winter time right now. So we might think, oh, well, we have too much static to work them. And it's like, no, this is a good time to work them from their viewpoint. And it's like, if you're on 10 meters, that's a good time to catch some of that stuff in South America.
And
so that's the analysis to do.
I think there's a great point too. I know a couple of guys are just getting into ham radio and they like tuning around. They're not quite ready to jump in and chase DX, but they find it interesting. The issue could be though, they're going to miss some stuff now that isn't going to be around for another 10 or 12 years, like you pointed out. But the other thing is sometimes the geography, as you pointed out, changes so much. And I can remember my father encouraged me to try to get East Germany on all these different bands, because if that wall comes down and this unifies, that's gone. And so there were several of us in Cincinnati that kind of like, okay, we need to do that. We need to do Czechoslovakia. We need to go Yugoslavia, make sure we have them on all bands, because this stuff really does change. As much as we sit back and say, well, it's all pretty static, it's not static. It changes quite a bit. And you never know who, how long was Albania not even allowed on the air, right? And all of a sudden they were. So,
Bill, talking, Ralph mentioned Bolivia, and I have been on 6 meters for 53 years, and I have never worked Bolivia. Just cannot catch that guy on. That is a tough place to work into. So yeah, I back up Ralph 100% on all this. Go ahead, Ralph.
Oh, yeah, I really like your comments, Bill, because one of my majors in college was geography. And the reason it was partially ham radio, you get to be aware, and I lived overseas, but I was just taking stuff. And one of the hams was in the geography department. And, after about 3.5 years, I wonder what my major should be. And so I get to talking to him is, well, you need to have like, algebra. And I said, well, I took 3 semesters of calculus. Is that okay? He says, it's okay. It says, oh, you got to have science. And I say, well, I took quantum physics. Is that okay? Yeah, that's okay. And then, it kind of went along that way. It's like, well, you need this. And, it ended up, I took every course in their department by the time I was done. And, it just kind of all fit together. But then I kept on going to school because our local university was, 10 minutes away. So it was pretty easy. When you have an assistantship, pretty much pays for your college, and you can work and go to school in the evenings kind of thing. So I hung around there. So let's summarize kind of what I said. I mean, I looked where I was and what I was going to do, and yeah, 6 meters. And then there's these places where I don't have these countries, but the guys aren't particularly active on particular lands. And Bill, you hit it exactly right, is be prepared for the uncommon activity. So, if you say, geez, I'm not on 12 meters, you're missing. Right now, there's a lot of good uncommon Asia stuff. If you want to work someplace like Cambodia or Vietnam, that's the band. And or even if you say, I haven't worked Indonesia yet, well, then you better get on like 12 meters, 15 meters, kind of in the evening, right a little bit after sunset. They're there. And we went for years without hearing those things, it was pretty hot. So you also have to be on the air and ready for the rare stuff to show up. So it's hard for me because I'm slowing down as I'm getting older and stuff doesn't always work. That's kind of why I have a stepper, but it never really has worked on 40. It just, I'm at their specs, but the elements don't go out enough so I can get on 40 meters CW. So that's where I use the 4-square, and I had a vertical up with a bunch of radials, but I dug it up so I could put 4-square in its place. And eventually I'll just go stick that vertical back up so I'll have some antenna. I think that's the trick. I don't care what you have. The good DXpeditions, and that could be a whole topic in itself. How do you work a hard DXpedition? Because that's really cool when guys figure that. Don't waste your time the first day unless you have a big setup. So always be ready for those rare ones. You don't want to miss them. Then come up with countries that you think you can get that are active. Keep on working to improve things and be on the air and find out who and if it was me and you could see who's these guys that are on some of these sessions, it's like you write down their call and say, this guy's doing what I'm doing. I got to get a hold of him and find out stuff. And I've, been on some of these Zoom sessions and the guy's like, well, you're doing just what I'm doing, but you're having more success. I got to talk to you about it, kind of thing. So figure out a way to find out, you know, when stuff is active. I mean, subscribe to the DX newsletters and the online websites. I mean, I always thought, oh, geez, it's too expensive. I didn't have the money. I was going to school, and you think, geez, you miss stuff, you know, that's only going to be on for 2 weeks. And then you also want to realize those guys that are taking 100 watts. And wasn't that a big pole that you brought somewhere, Joe? You bring those kind of antennas, you're not going to really work those unless you have something big set up. But find a way to kind of get notified. Here's expeditions that are coming up that you're going to have a chance to work. Let's go on to the next one here. So DX conventions are fun. You meet the guys. You go to DX dinners. You have local guys that are chasing it. So you meet the local DXers, the local clubs. You know, if you're into the low bands, you get on the ON4KST chat, and there's guys like on 160 every morning. They're kind of in there. I use DX Summit. I'm always using QRZ. I look up what some of these guys are using and find out, well, is this guy a station? Is it a club station? You know, how come they're able to get through? How come these guys are loud and somebody else isn't loud? I mean, I occupy my time that way a lot, you know, in a contest, just saying, why is this club station so loud? What are these guys doing? And it helps get you a sense of direction. So you also, when you find some of this stuff, you know, you drop a note to W3UR and you say, hey, here's the kind of DX that I was hearing. I use the DX World website because it has some of the cultural and detailed information about the countries. It's kind of summarized there. Reverse beacon network, you know, that you can see those where the spots are and who can hear you. That was always interesting to me when I was on the low bands, and I'd say, here's a guy in United Arab Emirates. His station is hearing me, but he's not on working people. You know, when you're spotted and you get an idea how strong your signal is, and you say, well, wait a minute, you know, I'm not really being heard in the far part of Europe. And that gives you a way to quantify it. That's why I started getting in the CWTs. When I first moved out here, I just threw up this off fed dipole, you know, at about 15 feet. And geez, I was lucky to work 30 people, you know. Then as I, through the years, made improvements, I get a dipole up a little higher, got a tower, hung some wires in the tower till it was finished getting built. Then you can quantify a little bit about, well, how's the signal doing? So that's why I kind of like, you know, the reverse beacon network, PSK reporter, those kind of things. You look at, you know, the DX maps, and you use the propagation forecasts, those kind of things to get better information about DX and how well you're doing, because you're not going to work that DX station if, you know, if you're barely making it into Japan. You're not going to get, like, Korea is a little bit harder, China is a little bit further, a little bit harder. So unless you can get a solid signal into Japan, you're not going to be able to get that next bit. So, I mean, that's why I'm in this continuous improvement kind of thing, because that's the only way to know. You're not just burning up time. You're saying, I'm improving things. My signals are a little bit better. Let's go to the next one here.
So do you use DX Labs?
Yes.
Yeah, I do too.
I use NMM for weekend contests, but I also have during the week as if it is a year-long contest. So I have one, and because sometimes I'll get on and I'll call CQ and a whole bunch of guys are calling, and I just log them as if you were logging in a contest. So I have a sort of a daily DX contest that accepts all modes as part of N1MM. And then I use the database feature of DX Labs. One of the problems is when Logbook of the World started, I was already 1,500 countries behind. And it wasn't, I mean, you can't see it here, but there's about 70 shoe boxes of QSL cards. I don't know if I have time left to go through and pull out all of them and do the data entry to get those electronic versions into DX Labs.
Right.
So that, again, that's a really good point, though. For a guy that's at 100 countries, do some electronic logging, do something like DX Lab. And you'll be thankful years later when you say, you know, it's all electronic. I can do alerts or phone or text myself when stuff comes up. But so there are features that aren't realistic at this point for me to use.
Yeah,
to
we're
keep
going to
track.
have, we'll have Dave, the designer and publisher of DX Labs on here, I think next week.
Oh, excellent.
And I've used this for a number of years, and I can't wait to talk to him about some things I didn't quite understand. Or, hey, and to your point, out of my left screen here, I can see Kuwait, Western Malaysia, Japan, and now Cambodia have all appeared on 12 meters. So, yeah. So to your point, if you need that and you're not on 12 meters, that's what you're missing. So, but anyway, that's a side.
Yeah, I mean, that's when we could do a thing on propagation, because there are seasonal cycles, daily cycles, you know, the sunspot longer cycles of these things. And the really cool stuff that shows up on some of these bands that we didn't have before, or 10 meters is not quite good enough, and so you don't hear them. And you find the habit of these guys and saying, you know, there are a handful of guys in Kuwait that are on, but here's where they're active.
Right.
Sometimes you have to beg them, say, can we go to 40 meters?
Yeah.
You know,
So,
might have been on 40 a couple years ago, but now do it.
So why is some DX so rare, Ralph?
I like this one, and I think there's more coming, but some of it is just really remote. There's a big effort to, you know, put Bouvet on again, and it's really difficult and it's really expensive. You know, we're looking at budgets of $400,000 to get a couple of people there for a couple weeks, and it's dangerous. And then there's places that are just nasty to go to, 120 degrees and mosquitoes, you know, and who wants to go there? And you think, why were people living there 100 years ago? You know, what were they thinking? You know, so that's hard. And then the politics changed. You know, I was lucky to get North Korea because a guy worked with the World Food Program, and he was allowed to set up his radio for a while, and he was on, and then one day they told him to shut down, and that was it. And I never got him on CW, not thinking back then that, well, I should have begged him, you know, to get on CW, and I would have had all countries on CW. So that's hard. And then what's happening in the Pacific Islands, you know, we have like hundreds of trees around here, and I've never sort of seen a bird run into one, you know, but certain people think that a guy wire a bird will run into it. And then especially if you put a little flag on it, the bird will understand, you know, that the flag will warn you. So I have to joke on that because, you know, I do believe in the conservation, but that's where I like the rig in the box to say, we'll have limited impact. And what the other thing that I like is, you know, some of the groups that have gone to places like that will say, we'll spend a couple hours picking up plastic and garbage because the 2 or 3 wildlifers can't tackle a project like that, and we got 10 guys and we can make an impact. So I always like that, you know, if you're doing something for the local area, or even bringing papers and pencils for a local school and you're in a remote place, those are really good. So politics change. And I do have in my presentations, why is North Africa, not bordering the Mediterranean, but right below, why is that so difficult to get? And then you look from one country to the next, and there's political coups that have been going on. And there's enough upheaval that they're not available. You know, a lot of the places they just don't have the infrastructure. I've been watching YouTube videos. There's at least 150 called Itchy Boots. And a lady has ridden a motorcycle all the way around the coast of Africa, America, from South America up to Alaska, and all over Europe and parts of Russia that we could go to today. And, you know, I noticed a lot of things that she kind of mentions, but just along the coast in some countries, you have electricity, but you get a few miles in, they've got a few solar panels, basically no electricity. In her case, we don't have internet access. I can't upload and send you this, you know, video, but I look at and say, well, there's places that just don't have electricity.
Yes.
You know, or it's marginal. Or some of the expeditions that have been going on, they'll say, you know, oh, we were without for about 4 hours today. And, places they don't have enough gasoline that they would even sell you gasoline. So, a lot of the infrastructure that we take for granted is just not there. Other places, there's just not many operators. They're pretty remote. The guys are doing other things besides radio. Radio is kind of difficult thing. In a way, it's a rich man's hobby from some perspective. The other thing that kind of strikes me is, we take for granted that we can get coax and wire. We can order it from DX Engineering and it comes in a couple of days. In my town, which we're not industrial, we have some universities and hospitals. I can't get fuses. I had to go to the truck stop if I want fuses. There's no electronic part. I wanted to get some ring terminals to use on my verticals. We have about 8 places that sell electrical parts, electrical supplies. 6 of them did not have any terminals, or they'd say, well, we're out of stock and we can't get that stuff. So even me here in rural America, I can't find stuff, or we can order it. But, other guys, they say, well, it would take me weeks and weeks or a month to get some things that we take for granted. So that's where I keep thinking expeditions, you should be trying to leave your wire or your connectors instead of bringing it back home. We take it for granted, that we can find radios. There's tons of used radios out there, and stuff that's transistorized and good. And well, they don't have in a lot of countries at all. So, you find club stations, but it's interesting too, because we have so much new technology. We've got cell phones everywhere. We don't need hams like we used to, and that was our communications when we all got kind of started in radio, is we used the two-way radios. We didn't. So the other thing that we'll notice is, one my wife does not understand is the concept of local noise. When there's a bunch of noise around me and she's talking, I can't hear what she's saying.
Yeah.
Well, the same thing is true if you live in town and you got a bunch of local noise. You're not going to hear what's happening in the bands. And I noticed this like when I got on FT8, and there's guys that are really strong and they're not going back to anybody, and it's like, why can't they hear?
Yeah.
And then I have some pictures, like in Nepal, and there's all these wires. I remember we went to Venezuela on an expedition, and the way they got electricity is they just use some wire on top of the power lines and bought electricity that way. So, for us, we've got electricity and it's quiet. I can look out there and in the next mile I can see, the 4 power poles, and there's no problem at all with electrical noise.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, we've got constraints, homeowners associations. I would never move to a homeowners association, but some people do because of their spouses. But if you're serious DXer, you can't do that. You might be constrained by tower height, and it's harder and harder to find tower crews and get up big antennas. So, you got a balance here. I got a young family and I got kids and I'm busy with work kind of stuff. So, those are the constraints that we always had. If you're looking for low band DX, I was lucky to be able to get first 100 countries on 80 meters with 100 watts. But I did it by saying, well, what are the close countries? Because boy, it was hard to work anything besides England or France, anything that was that far away. So it was like Caribbean kind of stuff, a few South Americans, Hawaii was hard, but you start looking at distance and you can get 100 pretty close in countries on 80 meters. We talked just a little bit about propagation. Now is the time, like this time of day in the Midwest, get on and work Asia. And then I guess your own skill, you got to keep working on your own skill, being able to hear stuff, get on CW, figure out what your operating habits can be. Because if you're on the same time every single day, you're going to miss a lot of the openings. And it's rough if you got to go to work and be there at 8 or 9 in the morning. That's a pretty good time to get on some of these higher bands as they start to crack open.
The one thing that you mentioned is spending time in front of the rig, so to speak, or the butt in the chair. And I can't tell you how many times Joe and I have talked about You know, how many guys don't really know their radio? You know, they probably use 15% of it because, you know, they listen for a signal, they go split, they transmit, they work somebody and they're done. They never drill down on the filters. They never drill down on tracking filters and all these other cool things because that, you know, that takes some time and it takes some study and it takes some effort. But boy, once you got it, and Ralph, you strike me as one of those guys that something I did recently. Sometimes you have to adjust your work schedule. So I'm going to go 10 to 6 or 10 to 7 because I need that morning gray line. And I think you got to think that way, or as you said, you're going to miss them.
Yeah.
You do have to concentrate on when is sunrise and sunset at the other end. You know, that's kind of what we're tracking. So here's the example for the guys that can't, you know, are just listening to this, a picture of Kathmandu in Nepal, and there's just wires strung everywhere above the street.
Wow.
And you see that's why they can't hear. And I run into 9N 7AA a lot, and he can't hear in the city, you know, and he knows that, but he gets on, works people, and he tries to get out in the country where it's quieter. But that's a perfect example of why it's difficult for people in the cities to hear.
And
And
you
then
worked
here,
yesterday, Bill, or today?
Yeah, I did actually. That was my first Nepal 9N7AA last night on 15 CW. So, and I've been chasing that rascal for 2 or 3 years, and I just couldn't get there. And then of all things, to work him on CW last night on 15. So, you just don't know.
yeah, he's just fun to chase down, and he can operate his station in Slovenia when he is in Nepal, which is interesting because then I scratch my head. It's like, did you go home on vacation? Or are you just operating that over here? And like, how did you get back to Nepal so fast to be able to operate? So it's interesting, but it is neat to have a really, really good operator at the other end that's willing to work through the pileups and get the volume down and work to that next level of people.
I hope you found that as interesting as I did. I'm really looking forward to getting part 2 out to you soon, as I know there's so much more to learn from Ralph. Thank you for joining us on this edition of the DX Mentor. I would like to thank our sponsors, ICOM America, the Daily DX, DX Engineering, and the Southwest Ohio DX Association. You won't find anyone more committed to DX than these sponsors. And of course, I would especially like to thank our guests today, Ralph, K9ZO, and Joe, WAGEX. I would love to have your feedback, answer your questions, and provide help with any DX or amateur radio issues that you may have. If you need clarification on something or you just have a question, email me at thedxmentor@gmail.com. Please drop me a line if you've achieved an all-time new one, received recognition, or have a DX event that you would like us to mention. We would be happy to do that. If you're enjoying these DX Mentor episodes, please hit the subscribe button. You can also click like if you found this one particularly interesting. If you don't really want to subscribe, please drop me a note and let me know why. I just want to get better. So 7-3 for this episode. Thanks to my XYL Karen for her love and support, and I hope to see you in the pileups.